The latch held. That was the first thing he noticed in the dark. Not the wind, not the cold, not the long deep groan of timber bearing more weight than timber was meant to bear. It was the iron latch on the inside of the door, the one he had forged crooked in a borrowed shop in the autumn, the one his neighbor had laughed at and called a child's idea of a lock. It rattled once against its keeper and then sat still. Snow pressed against the other side of that door at a depth no man in Crook County could yet measure. The latch held. Caleb Renner did not move from where he sat. He listened. The boy slept against his shoulder, breath shallow and warm through the wool. The girl slept across the room, with her face turned to the wall, the way she always slept since her mother had gone 2 winters before. The fire in the small clay hearth burned low and steady on a single piece of split pine, and the air in the room, 8 feet underground, banked on 3 sides by packed earth and river stone, held at a temperature that a man outside would have prayed for and not received. Above them, the world was ending. He could hear it only as a kind of muffled hush, the way deep water sounds from the bottom of a well. 6 weeks earlier, Caleb Renner had stood at the edge of a frostbitten draw 3 miles south of Sundance, Wyoming, with $12 in his pocket, a shovel borrowed from a man who did not expect it back, and an idea every grown man in the county had called a fool's errand. He was 31 years old in the autumn of 1887. He had a son of 6 and a daughter of 9 and no wife to help him through the coming winter. And the small clapboard house his late wife's brother had let him rent on the flats was not a house any longer in the meaningful sense of the word. The roof had given up in August. The stovepipe leaked smoke into the rooms when the wind came from the north, which it had begun to do in September, with a steadiness that worried older men. He had $38 saved between a tin under the floorboard and a folded note from the bank in Sundance, and most of that would go to flour and salt and a quarter side of pork before the first hard freeze. He could not afford to rebuild the roof. He could not afford to move. He could not afford to be wrong. What he could afford was $12 worth of nails, hinges, oilcloth and lamp oil, and a piece of land no one wanted, a south-facing scrap of hillside 2 acres up the draw, leaning into a windbreak of scrub cedar and old buffalo grass, with a seep of clean water that ran 6 months of the year and a vein of soft clay that ran the rest. The land had been turned down by 3 homesteaders before him because it could not be plowed. He had walked it twice in late September and decided that he did not need to plow it. He needed to go inside it. The first man to laugh at him was the Reverend Amos Pell, who rode out one Saturday afternoon under the pretense of bringing a tract about temperance and stayed on horseback the whole time he spoke. The Reverend was a tall, thin, soft-voiced man who pitied his congregation with the same even tone in which he condemned its sins, and he looked down at Caleb from the saddle and said, in the voice of a man making a decision on someone else's behalf, that a Christian father did not bury his children in the ground before the Lord asked him to. He said it without heat. He said it the way a man corrects a clerk who has miscounted change. Then he turned the horse and rode off down the draw, and Caleb went back to the shovel. The second man came on foot the following Tuesday. His name was Asa Whitaker, and he was Caleb's age within a year, and they had once cut firewood together in the summer of '83 in a stand of lodgepole north of the Bell Forge. Asa was a good neighbor in the ordinary sense. He did not steal. He did not lie about his hogs, and he would lend a saw if asked twice. He stood at the edge of the hole Caleb had begun and looked down into it for a long time. He did not laugh at first. He took off his hat and rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the children playing in the cedar shadow. "Caleb," he said, "friend, there is nothing in that dirt for those young ones." Caleb leaned on the shovel. He did not answer. "I will say it plain because no one else has." Asa's voice was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was patient. "Your wife is gone. That is not your fault, and it is not their fault, and a man in your situation does not have to prove anything to this valley. You can come down to my place when the snow comes. We will manage. My Sarah would not turn out a child of yours. You know that. You do not have to do this." He gestured down at the hole. He shook his head with the small private sorrow of a man who believed he was watching grief turn into something worse than grief. "It will not hold," Asa said. "It will fall on them while they sleep. I am telling you because I knew her, and she would not have wanted this." He waited. When Caleb did not answer, he put his hat back on and walked down the draw the way the Reverend had ridden, and the only difference was that Asa looked back twice, and the Reverend had not looked back at all. That night, in the leaning clapboard house with the bad roof, Caleb sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and read again. By the light of a single tallow stub, the small water-stained book he had taken out of a dead man's saddlebag 4 years before. The dead man had been a trapper named Bidwell, found frozen upright against a deadfall in the spring of '83, with his eyes open and one mitten missing, and no apparent injury, his horse standing patient 10 feet away. Caleb had been one of 3 men who brought the body in. The saddlebag had contained a tin of pipe tobacco, a folded letter to a woman in St. Joseph that no one ever mailed because there was no address on it, and a cloth-bound almanac that had been printed in Philadelphia in 1859 and annotated in pencil on nearly every page by a hand that pressed hard enough to score the paper. The sheriff had asked if anyone wanted the book. No one had. Caleb had taken it home and not opened it for a year. He had opened it the first winter after his wife died, because he could not sleep, and the pencil annotations had begun to teach him things he did not know he needed to know. The almanac itself was a common sort of farmer's book, moon phases, frost charts, crop rotations for the eastern states that meant nothing in the Wyoming draws. The annotations were something else. They were the marginal notes of a man who had spent 30 winters alone in a country that did not forgive, and who had learned, by trial and by burying friends, the difference between a shelter that looked warm and a shelter that was warm. On a page about root cellars, Bidwell had written, in cramped pencil, "Cold falls. Heat does not climb if the dirt is right. A man in the ground keeps the warmth his own body makes. A man in a cabin loses it to the sky." On a page about hay storage, "Dead air is the cheapest blanket on earth. 2 walls 1 inch apart hold more heat than 1 wall a foot thick." The Shoshone knew this before they had a word for it, on a blank page near the back, in a different and steadier hand, as if written years later. The hillside is the only honest wall. The hillside does not lie about its temperature. Find a south slope, cut into it, berm the front, vent the top, leave dead air between. Anyone who tells you differently has not buried a child in February. Caleb had read those pages many times. He had not understood them at first. He understood them now. He worked at the hillside for 6 days before he reached anything like a rhythm. The clay was soft only in the top 18 inches. Below that, it turned to a kind of pale shale that broke off in dinner plate sheets and rang against the shovel. He learned to read the seams. He learned which angle of strike sent a sheet sliding free and which angle only chipped. His hands cracked at the knuckles and bled into the leather of his gloves, and the blood dried and became part of the leather, and on the 7th morning he could open and close his fingers without thinking about it. The hole he was digging was not a hole in the way a grave is a hole, though more than one passing rider made that joke at the saloon. It was a chamber, 12 feet deep into the hillside, 8 feet wide, 7 feet high at the back and sloping to 6 feet at the front, with the long axis running east to west, so that the south-facing front wall would catch every hour of winter sun the latitude allowed. The front wall, the only wall that would face the weather, he framed with the cheapest green pine he could buy from a man who was leaving the country and needed the money fast. He set the frame 2 feet out from the actual cut into the hill. The 2-foot space between the pine frame and the earth he packed with dry cedar bark, dry grass and ash from the old clapboard stove, layered in thin courses like a baker laying pastry. That was the dead air. That was Bidwell's cheapest blanket. He hung the door on hinges he traded a half day of labor for. He cut the door narrow, 22 inches, because every inch of door was an inch of cold. He set the latch himself, in the borrowed shop, and yes, he set it crooked, and when his neighbor came in and saw it on the workbench, he said it looked like something a drunkard had made on a dare. And Caleb said nothing and took the latch home. He cut one window, small, 8 inches by 10, set high on the south wall, glazed with a single pane of greenhouse glass he bought from a widow in Sundance for $1.20, sealed all around with pitch and a strip of soaked rawhide that would shrink as it dried and pull the glass tight into its frame. He put a wooden shutter on the inside of the window. He could close it in a storm. He could open it in the sun. The roof of the chamber was not a roof in the cabin sense. It was the hill itself. He had left 4 feet of undisturbed earth between the ceiling of his cut and the open sky, and over that 4 feet, before the ground froze, he laid a single course of flat river stones from the dry creek bed, and over the stones a foot of packed sod cut from the meadow with a borrowed turf knife, grass side down, then grass side up, in the manner of the old sod houses on the Nebraska flats. He had read about that in the almanac, too. The grass roots, Bidwell had noted, would knit through the winter and hold the sod against the spring melt. The stove was the part he could not afford to do well, so he did it cheaply and carefully. He had no money for a cast-iron stove. He had a length of stovepipe from the old house, and a flat slab of slate from the creek, and 2 days of work, building a small clay and stone hearth set against the back wall of the chamber, with the pipe running up through a hole he had bored at an angle through the 4 feet of earth above, sleeved in another length of pipe so that the hot inner flue would not touch the dirt directly. He banked the hearth with stones the size of a man's 2 fists, set tight, mortared with clay. The stones, he knew from the almanac, would hold heat for hours after the fire went out. Thermal mass, Bidwell had written, underlining it twice. A small fire in a stone hearth warms a room longer than a big fire in an iron box. The stone gives back what the fire put in. He laid in firewood for 4 months. He laid in flour and salt pork and dried beans and a small sack of coffee and a smaller sack of sugar and a tin of lard. He cut and stacked hay for the 1 milk goat, who would sleep in a partitioned alcove just inside the door, both for her warmth and for the milk the children would need. He hung a curtain of heavy wool between the goat's alcove and the main chamber. He drove the last stake into the front berm on the morning of the 11th of November, 1887, and he did not celebrate. He went inside and made coffee on the small hearth and listened to the way the chamber sounded when the wind came up outside. And he heard almost nothing. And that almost nothing was the sound of $12 and 6 weeks of work doing what he had asked it to do. He moved the children in the next morning. The girl was quiet about it. The boy cried because he was 6, and the new place smelled like dirt and goat and pine pitch, and Caleb let him cry and did not try to talk him out of it. And by the second night the boy was asleep against his father's shoulder in front of the hearth, as if he had been born there. The Reverend rode by once more in late November and looked at the door set into the hillside and did not dismount. Asa did not come at all. There was talk in town. Caleb heard it secondhand from the man who sold him kerosene. A man who put his children in a hole in the ground was a man the valley would have opinions about. Caleb thanked the man for the kerosene and went home. The storm began on the 14th of December. It did not begin the way the storms and stories begin. It began with a gray sky at noon, and a wind that smelled faintly of iron, and a thermometer on the inside of the small high window that read 14 above zero at 3 in the afternoon, and -11 at midnight. The snow began in the small hours of the 15th. By dawn there were 4 inches on the sill. By the second dawn there were 2 feet on the level ground outside, and drifted to the eaves of every cabin in the valley that still had eaves. By the third dawn no one in the valley knew what the level ground looked like any longer, and the wind had not yet reached its full mind. It was on the 3rd night, around the hour when a man stops counting hours, that Caleb heard a sound he could not place. It came from beneath the floor, a low groan, slow, the way a tree sounds in a high wind from a long way off, except there was no wind down here, and there were no trees. He sat up from the pallet. The boy stirred against him and settled. The girl did not wake. The goat shifted in her alcove and was still. He listened. The sound came again, longer this time. It seemed to travel along the length of the chamber from the back wall toward the front, and then it stopped, and the chamber was quiet again, except for the small soft tick of the hearthstones cooling. He did not know yet whether it was the hillside, settling under the weight of the snow above, or whether something in his work was beginning to give. He lay back down. He did not sleep. He listened until the gray light came up in the small high window, and the sound did not come again. And when he rose to put another piece of pine on the hearth, he saw that the girl had woken in the night, without his knowing, and was watching him from across the room with her steady grave face. And she said nothing, and he said nothing, and he nodded once to her, and she nodded once to him. And that was the conversation they had about the sound under the floor. By the 5th day the snow had reached the bottom of the high window. By the 6th it had passed the top. The chamber went dark in the middle of the afternoon and stayed dark, and Caleb lit the small kerosene lamp and turned the wick low and rationed it, because he had laid in oil for a winter, but not for a winter sealed under snow. On the morning of the 7th day the boy began to cough. It was not a small cough. It was the cough Caleb had heard before in the lungs of his wife 2 winters past. The cough that started in the back of the throat and worked its way down into the chest and stayed there. He did not panic. Panic was a thing he had buried with her. He set water to warm on the hearth, and broke a piece of the salt pork into the water, and made a thin broth, and held the boy's head against his shoulder, and gave him the broth a spoon at a time, and listened to the cough and tried to read it. The cough did not get worse by noon. It did not get better. The boy slept and woke and slept again. It was in the afternoon of the 7th day, while the boy slept, and the girl read aloud from the only book they had brought into the chamber. A child's primer with a green cover, her mother's hand still in the margin where she had written the girl's name. That Caleb noticed the milk goat was not in her alcove. He had let her out earlier to walk the length of the chamber, as he did once a day, for her legs. He had not seen her go back in. He looked behind the wool curtain. The alcove was empty. He looked along the back wall. He looked behind the firewood stack. The goat was not in the chamber. The goat could not be outside. The door had not been opened in 5 days. The door could not be opened. He had tried the day before to see what the snow looked like, and the door had moved an inch and stopped against a wall of packed white that gave like cold iron and did not give further. He looked again, more carefully, and he found her. She had wedged herself behind the firewood stack, against the back wall of the chamber, where the earth was warmest. She was lying down. She was breathing. She was not standing up when he called her, and a milk goat that does not stand up when called is a milk goat that has decided something. He knelt by her in the lamplight. He put his hand on her side. He felt the slow heat of her under the hair. He felt, also, the soft press of a hoof from inside her, and then another. She was in kid. He had not known. He had bought her in October from a man who had not said, and she had not shown, and he had not thought to look, because a man with $12 and a hillside to dig does not look closely at the belly of a goat in October. She was in kid in the middle of a snowstorm that had buried the door of his shelter, with a son who was coughing the way his mother had coughed, and a daughter who was 9 and reading a primer in a hole in the ground in the dark. He sat back on his heels. He closed his eyes for one breath. He opened them. He brought the girl over. He explained in 3 short sentences what was happening and what she would need to do, and the girl did not cry and did not ask questions, because she was her mother's daughter and her father's daughter both, and she nodded once and went to the hearth to set more water on. The kid came in the small hours of the 8th day, then a second kid, smaller, slower, half an hour behind. Caleb worked with the calm of a man who had helped his wife birth 2 children in the same room he had lost her in, and the girl held the lamp steady at the angle he needed, and the boy slept through it with his cough rattling in his small chest, and when it was done, there were 2 wet, warm new creatures in the alcove, and the doe was standing again and licking them. And the chamber smelled of birth and lamp oil and pine smoke, and the temperature inside by the small thermometer on the wall had not dropped below 46 degrees. Outside, at that hour, in a hollow 3 miles to the south, a thermometer on Asa Whitaker's porch would later be found to have read -38. The storm broke on the morning of the 10th day. The wind went still around 3 in the morning, and Caleb woke into the stillness the way a man wakes when a clock that has been ticking for 10 days stops. He lay listening. The boy's breath beside him was easier. The cough had loosened. The girl slept on her side with one hand under her cheek. The goats were quiet in the alcove. The hearth ticked. He got up. He pulled on his coat and his boots. He took the small spade he had kept inside for this exact purpose. He lifted the latch on the inside of the door, the latch his neighbor had called a child's idea of a lock. And he pushed. The door moved an inch and stopped. He had expected this. He had built for this. He set the spade against the snow and began to dig upward and outward, at the angle Bidwell's almanac had told him to dig, which was not straight out but up and to the south, following the line of the front berm, breaking through into what he hoped would be a wind-scoured patch on the lee of the cedar break. He dug for an hour. He dug through snow that had set like sugar, and then, 6 feet on, through snow that had not set at all, and came down in soft white falls around his shoulders. He came up into daylight at the 8th foot. He stood up out of the snow tunnel he had made, with his head and shoulders above the new white surface of the world, and he looked. The valley was gone, not damaged, gone. The shape of it had changed. Drifts rose where cabins had been and lay flat where pastures had stood. The Reverend's white-painted church 1.5 miles down the draw was a long humped shape under snow, with only the dark line of the bell tower showing. He could not see Asa Whitaker's place from where he stood, because the drift between had grown taller than the cottonwoods that used to mark it. There was no smoke anywhere. There was no sound anywhere. There was only the bright cold morning and the new geography that the storm had drawn over the old one. He went back inside. He closed the door. He latched it. He sat down by the hearth and put his hand on his sleeping son's forehead and felt that the fever had gone, and he did not say anything, because there was no one there to say it to, and nothing he would have said if there had been. It was 2 days more before he heard the first knock. It was not a knock in the ordinary sense. It was a scratching, high up on the door, the sound of a hand reaching down into his snow tunnel and finding wood at the bottom of it. He rose from the hearth and crossed the chamber. He set his ear to the door. He heard breathing on the other side, ragged, and a voice he knew but could not yet place saying something that was not words but was meant to be. He worked the latch. He pulled. Asa Whitaker fell into the chamber. He fell because he had been leaning against the door with the last of what he had. He had no hat. His coat was open at the throat. His face was the color a face gets when a man has walked a long way through a deep cold with not enough on, and his hands were shaking and had gone into the still phase, which is the worst phase. Behind him, in the snow tunnel, were 2 more shapes. His wife Sarah, holding a bundle that did not move, and behind her the Reverend Pell, on his hands and knees, in a coat that had been a good coat in November, and was not a good coat now. Caleb did not speak. He did not have to. He took Asa under the arms and dragged him to the hearth and sat him against the stones. He went back for Sarah. He took the bundle from her first and gave it to his daughter without a word, and the girl took it, the way her mother would have taken it, and unwrapped it by the fire, and the bundle was a small boy of perhaps 2 who was breathing and was alive. He went back for the Reverend. The Reverend tried to stand to walk in on his own dignity and could not, and Caleb did not insist on the dignity, and brought him in the way he had brought the others. He closed the door. He latched it. The chamber was full now. 3 more bodies, and a baby, and the goats with their 2 new kids, and his own son and daughter, and himself, and a fire he had built to warm 3, and that was warming 9. He banked the fire higher. He set the broth pot back on. He cut bread. He worked. No one spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say that the room was not already saying. Asa came back to himself first. His hands began to ache, which was the right sign. He looked around the chamber from where he sat against the warm stones of the hearth. He looked at the small high window with its single pane of greenhouse glass and its wooden inside shutter. He looked at the cedar bark packing visible in a corner where Caleb had not finished the inside paneling. He looked at the curtain over the goat's alcove, and at the firewood stacked along the back wall, and at the 2 children, his friend's children, who were alive and warm and unsurprised by any of this, because they had been living in this chamber for a month, and to them this was simply the place where their father had decided they would not die. Asa did not say what he had come to say. He had come, perhaps, to say I was wrong, or forgive me, or thank you, or some other thing of the size the moment seemed to require. He did not say any of them. He looked at Caleb across the small warm room, and he opened his mouth, and he closed it, and he looked down at his hands, which were beginning to remember how to be hands. The Reverend did not speak either. He sat where Caleb had set him. He watched the fire. After a long while he reached out and put one trembling palm flat against a stone of the hearth. The way a man checks whether a thing is real, Caleb fed them. He fed Sarah first because she had the baby. He fed the Reverend next because the Reverend was the oldest. He fed Asa last. He gave them broth and bread and a little of the salt pork. He gave the baby warm goat's milk in a tin cup, a spoon at a time, the way he had given broth to his own son 4 days before. He did not ask what had happened in the valley. He did not ask whose cabins had not been held. He did not ask after the other families he had lived among for 9 years. He would learn all of that later. There would be time. Snow this deep was not a thing that went away in a week. His son woke in the middle of the afternoon and saw the room full of people and did not understand and began to cry. And Caleb picked him up and held him, and the cough was almost gone now, almost a memory. And the boy quieted against his shoulder the way he had quieted on the first night in this chamber, a month before. His daughter sat with the rescued baby on her lap by the hearth and rocked it without thinking. And the goats lay quiet behind their curtain, with their kids tucked against them, and the fire burned low and steady on a single piece of split pine, and the small clay hearth gave back the heat it had been given, and the dead air in the wall held what the hearth made, and the hillside above them held what the dead air did not catch, and outside the snow had stopped, and the wind had gone. and the bright cold morning lay over the valley like a clean cloth laid over something that was finished. No one spoke. Caleb sat down on the floor between his two children. He put one hand on his daughter's back. He put the other on his son's foot through the blanket. He looked at the door. The latch his neighbor had called a child's idea of a lock sat in its keeper, holding. The fire burned. The food was stacked. The boy slept against his shoulder. The girl read on. In the lamplight, where she had left off in the primer that had her mother's hand in the margin. The strongest walls are rarely the ones built to impress. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting on the trail ahead. The strongest walls are rarely the ones built to impress.